Welcome to Random Assignment, everybody. I'm Bob Bowden with Choice Media, and that is Corey DeAngelis of American Federation for Children. How you doing, Corey?
Doing pretty well. I was just on another live stream right before this. So it was actually supposed to be on Zoom. That didn't work out. So I said, hey, let's use my StreamYard account. But it's good to be on the Random Assignment podcast.
Okay. So, yeah, our title, basically, there are a couple of big lawsuits that are developing. Now, by the way, June is often a quiet time in the education space. Now, last year was a huge exception. We kind of thought everything would be shut down and locked down and there wouldn't be much going on. Well, there was a lot going on last year. This June, we actually are seeing a bit of a drop-off in some of the fights that have been raging so much because people are waiting to see what happens in August and September. But one of the things we've noticed is these lawsuits emerging where parents are saying, in some cases, just out of learning loss, my kid has suffered because of all these lockdowns, and we're going to call a lawyer about it. And in other cases, there's also a bullying case that has been making news in North Carolina. But let's go to this. Yeah, we'll do the NPR one first. And this, as you see here, a title: after months of special education turmoil, families say schools owe them. And for a long time, I don't know about you, Corey, I have often lamented this idea of judges taking over so much of education policy. That seems to be something that kind of government school enthusiasts love, the idea of these big bureaucratic school boards and meetings and elections and these one-size-fits-all decisions that are rigorously debated in the school board meetings. And then these big lawyers hired to fight about all of these decisions, whether this policy should be allowed or not, and lawsuits and more lawyers. Anyway, so this is rolling out in this sort of COVID version of all of this. And yes, the NPR story tells, some anecdote accounts, as it often does. This about a kid from Michigan, or a mom that says her and her 7-year-old son, Finn, learning from home without extra support, found it mentally and physically and emotionally draining. Quote, I just watched my child not learning and going backwards, says a different mother, this one in Maryland, whose 6-year-old daughter has an intellectual disability and an attention deficit disorder problem. I'm just sad for her. And so, you might see this as the backlash to so many of the union policies that locked down schools and sued to keep them closed when other people were ready to reopen them after COVID. But the fact that this is now turning into a new area of case law was one piece of news this week. What do you think?
Yeah, so are the families citing IDEA and saying, you didn't meet your obligations to my child, so therefore,
yes.
Are they trying to get like damage payments, or is it?
It varies. It varies. Yes. In some cases, yeah, they are asking for damages. And in other cases, they just want some sort of educational remedy in terms of, forcing the school to do this or that it had not been doing, et cetera.
I think the schools should have to give the option of in-person instruction. I think that it's a problem, particularly for students with special needs over the past year, that they just weren't given that option. I think that's great. And then I also think it's interesting in terms of, you're not providing the service, give me the money so that I can do something else. I mean, we already have existing cases of families who point out that the district schools aren't providing an adequate education to their student with special needs, so they have the district pay for them to send their kid to a private school, the out-of-district transfer phenomena that we see. That should be the norm all the time. And you shouldn't have to go to a court.
Do you think most parents know about that? I don't think so. I think this is one of the underreported factors or subjects or truths in American education, that federal law, IDEA, it's called, allows for parents whose special needs kids are not being served well to get the district to pay private school tuition. It's sort of this unspoken voucher that's in all 50 states that's so rarely talked about.
Yeah, and the thing is, in order to figure all these things out and go through the hoops and winning the court case, that takes resources. And so I think a better way to do it is to just say, you don't feel like your child is getting an adequate education in this school, you shouldn't have to prove it in a court. You should just be able to take your children's allocated education dollars to the provider that does give them an adequate education. And so, yeah, I see kind of a similarity with what we've seen historically with IDEA, and then parents are kind of making similar arguments, I feel like, here, saying that, you haven't provided an adequate set of educational resources to me, so let me go somewhere else, or give me the funding back, or whatever they're calling for. At least provide better education in the traditional system.
Now, maybe years from now, the real COVID education reform story will just be the mountain of lawsuits that came along that forced all of these school districts to, let their people go, so to speak, if they were being forced to attend, certain public schools because the families didn't have money to go elsewhere and had no other options. Maybe there'll be so many lawsuits. That's eventually why the IRS gave you defined that Scientology as a church, because they just sued. Not that I'm supporting Scientology suing the IRS thousands of times to get redefined as a church and therefore tax free. But that's exactly the tactic that was used. That finally, who knows? Maybe this lawsuit tactic, which I decry. This is my duality on this, Corey. I hate the fact that lawsuits, are such an expensive, inefficient, and unfair way to adjudicate subjects in our country.
Our enemies use lawsuits whenever they can, even if the state constitution clearly shows that school choice is permissible. They'll use every single tactic they can. So why not fight back and try to get children's education dollars to follow them through lawsuits and through the state legislatures as well? So I think it could be worthwhile. Every single state constitution has a provision saying that the state will provide for either an adequate education or a thorough system of education, or some type of, not every single one has an adequacy clause, but every single state constitution has something in there to where the state is supposed to provide education to children. I think over the past year, there should have been more legal activity of families saying, here's the state constitution, your schools aren't even open, and you can't really say this remote style of instruction is all that valuable. How are you going to tell me this is an adequate form of education? The other side does it when they call for more funding in the traditional system. They say, oh, there's an adequacy clause in the Constitution. In order to make it an adequate education, you just need to throw more money at the problem. Well, why don't we say, okay, well, you want to do that? Let's provide a stronger argument. There's not an adequate education in the failing system, so let's allow that money to follow the child to a truly adequate provider that has stronger incentives to actually provide an adequate education.
Yeah, so this is something I have to confess I did not think about much until this week. Like we said before, for years, federal law called IDEA, says that a parent who feels their child is not receiving, a special needs child is not receiving adequate education, can sue. Sometimes they don't have to sue. The district will agree. Oftentimes they do have to go to court, but they can petition to get the district to pay for private school tuition. All 50 states, federal law, IDEA. Well, this has a nexus with the COVID shutdowns. And you're right. There could be millions of U.S. parents who say it's time to sue and get private school tuition. But now, of course, the districts, I'm sure, would say, oh, well, that's all over. This following school year will be normal. This was an act of God, and the NPR piece talks about that. You can't hold the district responsible for lack of performance during this unusual pandemic scenario. Yeah, this holding us responsible to those standards would be unfair because this is an act of God. But at any rate, we're seeing at least this to some degree be used. But all right, so that's
it doesn't take a huge leap in logic to then say, well, even when the schools are open, you're still not doing much for my child.
Yeah.
And so maybe more families will start to kind of think about these types of exit options.
I'll finish this just by saying this anecdote. A few years ago, we at Choice Media used freedom of information requests to find out data on over 20 school districts in New Jersey. There are something like over 550 school districts in New Jersey. By the way, it's a school district heavy state. It's a place where, you stand on the street corner, they'll probably name it a school district. But at any rate, So we included large, medium, small size districts to find out how much are we spending on IDEA private school tuition. Turns out, if it were aggregated and if we're all one district, no one had ever added this together, Corey. I'm sure in 49 other states, no one's ever added this together. If you add together all of the money districts were spending on private school tuition for special needs kids, it would have been the second largest district in the state, just behind Newark. And it was over $800 million spent every year on private school tuition. But it's hushed up. It's secret. They don't want to talk about it. The more parents that know about it, God forbid, the more parents that might want this private school tuition, guaranteed by federal law. And it's basically, we were calling it the secret voucher that hardly anyone knows about. And one last thing to say is that, yes, the parents with the resources to hire special needs consultants, to hire lawyers, to go in and debate with the districts, those tend to be more the richer or more upper middle class parents. So this is not just a voucher no one knows about that's in all 50 states, but it's a voucher that skews toward people with money and is much, much less available to low-income parents.
Let's make it available to everybody.
Yeah. All right. So go ahead. Your turn.
So let's get on favorite topic of the week. The biggest blow up coming from the backlash coming when it comes to a tweet from the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten. You also sent me this article about this new study from Rand. Here's the Chalkbeat article about it. Teachers' stress exceeded other workers this year. Survey finds.
Yeah. Survey. It just says, by the way, notice it just says survey. Somebody's survey said that. Oh, go ahead.
And then I noticed that Randy Weingarten really tweeted about it. She says, new study has found that teachers are more likely to have depression symptoms these months of intense effort.
Wow.
Sitting at home and battling.
Interesting.
Not to go
Neither
back
one
to
of them mentioned the source of that survey or
Yeah,
study, but that's odd. Oh, go ahead.
My first reaction, though, is come on, read the room. Other people had to go to work too. Families were essentially, if the teachers had trouble over this past year in the public school system, one, think about the teachers in the private school sector that actually went back to work in person. Two, think about the families who had to scramble because they were either out of a job because they had to go back into the household because the teachers unions were fighting to keep the schools closed. It's like everybody had a hard time this past year. Why single out teachers who in the public school system did not return to in-person instruction, even though schools were some of the safest places to be? But what you're getting at is this section here. I responded and said, really? In parentheses in the article that she shared, in parentheses, the study was financially supported by the two national teachers unions, the American Federation of Teachers and the NEA, the National Education Association. So, wow, they found the NEA funded, AFT funded study found that teachers, had it rough over the past year. And like, what is going on in their minds to say, we're going to fund this study? The two largest teachers unions, they must really have a PR disaster on their hands for them to just go this low and to try to reframe the narrative as though like, I know kids had it tough, but the teachers, we should really be worried about the teachers.
Right. Well, and also, I wonder if the way they phrased the question might have had some influence on the answers and the percentage results, right? What if there's a chance of that? Look, our side funds surveys also sometimes, and you and I will talk about that. So people from both sides of the school choice debate will fund surveys. The real question is, do you hire then a legitimate legitimate polling organization to conduct the survey, like Gallup or some of these well-known other pollsters, or do you kind of use someone who's an ideologically bent pollster? Because there are plenty of both, actually. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, too, is to be transparent. You should show the questions. Show when the Harvard University does their there's surveys on school choice and other education issues. They report what the questions were. I'm not sure that they haven't reported on what these questions were, but nevertheless, it ought to be available if it's not. And I would say yes. So and again, Chalkbeat does a lot of great work. Matt Barnum, writer for Chalkbeat, does a lot of great work. And oftentimes the writers, the journalists who write the stories don't write the headlines. But I've got to tell you, just survey finds is not a good way for Chalkbeat to write a headline about this story. It should have said, if nothing else, teacher union funded survey funds.
Yeah. That's leaving it out of the headline is pretty rough.
I mean, I guess Rand did the Rand organization did the survey itself, so they're legitimate. I should say that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I think most people are like, really? Like, what about the kids? What about the increases in teen suicide that were just reported by the CDC? 51% increase in female teenage suicide attempts. Yeah. Sorry, not suicide attempts.
Right.
Reported by the CDC relative to 2019. I think it was much lower for male students, but for female students, I believe it was age 12 to 17, pretty big spike. And what about the parents that had to deal with all this over the past year? It just seems odd to, you see what she's trying to do and say, oh, the poor teachers, which a lot of people saw as kind of tone deaf.
Not my reaction to first seeing the headline was, this is a group, teachers, who more than any other profession, correct me if I'm wrong, tweet me or email me, please. You have a group of people who are accustomed to messaging how terribly they're treated all the time. Do nurses constantly promote how poorly they're paid or badly they're treated? Do accountants promote this all the time? It is, I can't name another profession where this is part of the union's consistent strategy over years, not just COVID era, is to constantly say how teachers are so badly treated, so disrespected, so underpaid. It's part of it's like a culture in this one profession to all the time talk about that. So I see a survey, oh, look at this, teachers are stressed out. And I'm like, yeah, well, you know who's probably more stressed out? Really? The nurses and the doctors who were dealing with the COVID patients when we weren't sure anything about what this disease was? Or similar people who I guess never locked down because they were required to go into work every day while the teachers were home teaching over Zoom? Like, maybe those people were really more stressed. They just don't have the constant culture telling them to complain about how badly they're treated all the time. Yep. So that's why you don't see those surveys. That's not being reported. What the nurses are said about their stress. This is reported because of the teaching culture, the union part of the union emphasis to constantly talk about how badly they're all treated.
And another response that I saw was and that I have too, is that, well, if the teachers were upset because they had to do the in-person in addition to the hybrid, the remote learning at the same time, if that was an issue, well, the teachers unions kind of created this problem themselves by keeping the schools closed and by having the teachers have to switch from remote to in-person and to juggle all of these things. They could have just had the schools open for in-person instruction full-time like the private schools. It probably would have been a lot less stressful. So I think they created a lot of their own problems. Another response that I saw a lot, remember what the major teachers union said in response to the learning loss and the mental health issues with the children?
What's that?
They had their response was that, well, kids are resilient, right? Well, they'll get through it. The kids are resilient. I think the NEA had that in their report, and I believe Randy Weingarten said that on multiple media appearances. So there was a lot of people responding and saying, well, this is how it goes, right? This is how we're supposed to respond to these things, like you did before.
Oh, that's
so they're resilient, right?
Hoisting them on our own petard file. Yeah,
exactly. So that's all the responses I have to this new union study.
All right. Well, while we mentioned before the court case about the special needs kids, there was also this court case about bullying. And many people know that Florida, in the last 1.5 to 2 years ago, passed a special needs for a school choice for bullied kids law in Florida that was first of its kind in the country. When I first heard about that Florida law, I thought, wow, this could take, how do you argue? How do you complain about that if you're the teachers union to say, hey, bullied kids should have to walk back in there every day and take another beating? Like, how do you oppose that? So we have this now North Carolina case where this wasn't about school choice, by the way. This was seeking remuneration in terms of compensation. It was that the family wanted money for this case, but it has been approved by this court. It was the state Supreme Court ruling last week, the North Carolina State Supreme Court, that bullying is a legitimate cause to sue a school district, essentially, if your kid is not being protected. And so, copy paste on what I just said before about lamenting how lawyers are taking over education policy and judges and courts. But at the same time, I don't know, why not, right?
So you can sue them and get paid for damages, but you can't take it to a private school, right? But that would be the next. That could be the next step, to establish a program like they have in Florida, Hope Scholarships. If you're experience bullying in your public school, you can go to private school.
I just, I don't want to make too much out of this. It's because I did not ask for school choice, but it's, I don't know, in terms of just a publicity, public policy messaging thing. Like, I don't know how, you're the union, you've got to say why bullied kids don't get choice. I mean, I wouldn't want to be that lawyer, All right.
Yeah. Some other news in Pennsylvania. There's been a lot of action. They have.
Oh, I've seen you talking about Pennsylvania all week.
So that's kind of been the action this week. They have Senate Bill 1, which is a pretty big expansion of their 2 tax credit scholarship programs, and it passed out of their appropriations committee. And I'll just give you the votes really quickly. It was a straight party line vote. Every Republican voted in favor. Every Democrat voted against. Sometimes you get some deflectors, but it was a straight party line. And then it went to the Senate Education Committee yesterday. Both of these votes were actually yesterday. Straight party line again, 7-4, passed through. And now we were expecting it to be on the Senate floor today, but it might be tomorrow. But that's Senate Bill 1. They also have something called Senate Bill 733, which is an education savings account program for students with special needs. And that has passed their education committee 7-4 as well.
So when you see those partisan divides, you've got to assume Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania is a veto on this, right? Yeah.
And I think I don't know the composition of R's versus D's in each chamber, but I think we would need Democrats to override the veto in Pennsylvania. But who knows? Maybe it won't be a veto. Maybe Governor Wolf, even though he's not a friend of school choice, maybe he'll sit on it and let it become law. Who knows? But we'll see. Let's let him make that decision.
Okay. So I have to hit on this. I have to, I say have to hit on this. I don't love it, but doing this so much. But racial politics, again, in the news, the 74 with the story, a school discipline double take, how Catherine Lamont could turn back the clock with renewed focus on persistent racial disparities and ignite new feuds. I have some problems with how this story was written in several ways. There's several ways that I think it's skewed to kind of be a liberal perspective, so to speak. But for example, if you scroll down to, there's a paragraph that starts the Trump administration's sharp turn in direction. It's about the 4th paragraph. It says the Trump administration, with a few strokes of the pen, rolled back much of the Obama administration's civil rights work in schools, including guidance that sought to combat the nation's stark and persistent racial disparities in student suspensions and expulsions. And I want to just say a couple things about this. First of all, these kinds of stories commit the same kind of problem over and over again, which is they will They will prioritize what happens to the kids with suspensions and expulsions.
Mm-hmm.
And they will say, look how bad this is. There is a racial disparity in the percentage of suspensions and expulsions from a certain racial composition of students. What they will not, almost never talk about is how the good kids of the same people of color racial makeups that are considered to be deserved by this high suspension policy, how the kids that don't get suspended suffer when the bad kids stay in class or when the bad kids stay in school. In other words, this idea that if we should only look at the kids who are suspended and expelled and see what's best for them and design school policy purely around what's best for those kids ignores what happens to the other kids when those disruptive kids stay in class. I see this over and over. It drives me crazy. You can't set school discipline policy based only on what's best for the disruptive kids. But these stories keep appearing. And so, yes, I think it's no doubt that there are some conservative parents or even just ordinary non-aligned parents of color who don't really want super disruptive kids in class with their children. And these articles do not talk about this ever. The second thing I was going to say is there's kind of been a change. So, disparate impact has kind of been the way that a certain kind of liberal ideology will look at these racial issues and say, well, you can assume there's racial bias simply if a district has a percentage difference in how certain things like expulsions or suspensions are applied. There's a new movement that has happened called the ADOS movement, and it's now there's a separate fringe of it called FBA. ADOS means American Descendants of Slavery. They basically distinguished themselves from other Black immigrants who were not descendants of slaves and other people of color. So they would say Barack Obama was not a descendant of slaves, not ADOS. His dad was Kenyan and his mom was from Kansas, a white woman, and therefore he has no connection to slavery. They would say Kamala Harris has no connection to slavery. Her father, I believe, is Dominican and her mother was Indian. She had no connection to American slavery at any rate. And so they have made an argument that, and it's partly tied to a reparations concept, that because this particular group of people of color have suffered from not just slavery, but Jim Crow, et cetera. They need repair. This community needs special repair that's not applicable to other people of color. And therefore, what had been an old argument to say, that any disparity in outcomes is because of racism, they have changed this argument to say, well, no, there's another thing besides current racism. There's the damage done to families and culture from past racism that is different than if you are a modern African immigrant, say, and you've moved here from somewhere else. So by making this distinction, they, in a way, explode this concept that any racial disparity is purely racism, modern racism. For example, about 7-8 years ago in Seattle public schools, they noticed they have, for some reason, there's almost 1,000 at the time. There were about 1,000 kids that of Nigerian American, or maybe it was African immigrants, not just Nigeria, but there were about 1,000 kids in Seattle public schools who were immigrants from Africa, and they consistently did better on the tests than the African American kids. So this could not be, in other words, attributed to racism that's modern anyway, because these are kids essentially more or less the same skin color with this huge disparities in outcomes. Families also have huge disparities if you compare African immigrant family populations to African American populations. Things like marriage rates are far different. The concept here is to say that just by looking purely at statistics and seeing racial disparities in statistics, according to at least these new groups, and they fight with each other, by the way, this foundational Black Americans called FBA and this other group, ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery, But nevertheless, to say that it is purely modern racism, that is the only reason that we might see the only underpinning or cause of modern disparities in percentage outcomes, is ignoring this concept of long-term damage from past racism that they seek to repair through reparations, which the root word of reparations is repair. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, and I think it's very possible, and there's probably, and I don't know what the extent is to the bias in these discipline policies in schools, but I don't have that answer. I don't think anybody has the magic answer of how much this is happening and in what particular schools, because it's so hard to prove. But that's another great argument for letting families vote with their feet. If you're in a school that does that is discriminating against you, you should not be stuck in that system. And some families are disproportionately more likely to be stuck in systems that aren't valuing them. So that's another great argument to fund the student directly and allow them to vote with their feet.
If nothing else, I would love the coverage to at least explain that there are other points of view than to say that 100% of racial differences happening in schools today are caused by current racism. At least these stories could say, they don't have to advocate for the other point of view. They could just explain, there are other points of view. They could explain other reasons why marriage rates differ between African immigrants in the U.S. and African American descendants of slavery in the U.S. There are issues like that, in other words, that have to do with cultural damage over time to a culture that is not current racism. These stories don't do that. They just write it as if we all know that when you come into this woman who was in the Obama administration as the assistant secretary of education for civil rights, and now will be nominated by the new Biden administration and is about to see her Senate confirmation hearings, but she going back to her old job, in other words, to try to theoretically, to put it back in place, the Obama era rules to say if there's statistical differences, it's because of racism, we're going to come in. So the story should at least say this and make this point. But there's one other thing I also wanted to add, which is this idea that the federal government, they've got to come in and it's a 10th Amendment argument to say, I asked one time on a talk show with some really smart people, including Jay Green, by the way, was there. But I said, is it the belief that the federal government, is either smarter or more moral than all the people in the states? Are the people in the states, is the federal government the parent of the state governments? Are they they're somehow better? Are they better people than the people in the state government? It's the state government does it this way, but these federal overseers are going to come in and they get to just change how you want to do things in your state. I guess it's an old slavery argument, because otherwise, this Confederacy will degenerate into slavery or something. You've got to have them or Jim Crow or something. You've got to have them march in and do this stuff. I'm pretty wary of that. As someone who grew up in Texas, as you did, I'm pretty wary of this idea. The federal government is more moral than the rest of us in states, and they need to just be considered better people than we are, and they can just, we're children, and they should just come in and correct us if they don't like what we're doing, because, by the way, they take money from us and they give some of it back. If we're nice, they give more of it back, but they're really the bosses. The federal government are the bosses of state policymakers I think it's unconstitutional.
Well, and do we think that the federal bureaucrats have the information and resources and competence to figure out what's going on the ground in a particular state? Maybe even if they have the best intentions and if the rule is the right rule, how do we know whether they're going to enforce it in the right way and be able to actually change things? So
from thousands of miles away. Exactly. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. They fly in, or they have a couple of satellite offices and, one or two people or something. And somehow they know what's on the ground better than all the people who are actually there. It's like when the Obama administration sued to end the Louisiana school voucher plan, and why? Well, they figured out there were a few places where it increased segregation because, in this place, this school district had like more white kids using the voucher for private school than black families using the voucher for private school. No evidence anyone was blocked from entering a particular school they wanted to go to. No evidence of anything. They just used statistics and said, oh, look, a higher percentage, therefore increasing segregation, therefore immoral and wrong, therefore we'll fly into your state and tell you we're going to sue you anyway to tell you to stop doing it.
Well, in the peer-reviewed journal article on the evaluation of the program found net racial integration as a result of the Louisiana voucher program. So yeah, it's like they couldn't even figure out how to do the
they had to pick
research.
They had to pick certain districts where, oh, look, that one district, the statistics are, I've seen this my whole life in this space. I've seen a town that I used to live in where the one charter school, the town had a bunch of schools. The one charter school was a higher percentage white, lower percentage minority than the district. So they sued the town, the school board sued the charter school. No evidence of racism, no evidence of any bigotry at all, just simply based on the fact that it had a higher percentage of white kids, even though the district itself had some of its own schools with a higher percentage of white population than that charter school.
Yeah,
like that. So they had their own, some of their own schools were higher percentage white than the charter school, but the charter school was bad because it was slightly higher white than the district generally. It's absurd. It's based, yes, it's co-opting the moral the moral argument for freedom and against racism and against bias. It's co-opting the civil rights era moral authenticity to then apply to something else because we want to hurt our competitor and we can do it.
Yep.
With this cudgel that we've come up with, we can make them seem like they're evil, which what they really are is just competing against us. But we're not going to say that. We're going to say, oh well, there's some sort of Klan members. There's some kind of racist. Look at the statistical percent differences.
Well, you see the same thing when it's a higher percentage of people of color in the schools than in the overall community too, and then they'll say that's segregation too.
Yeah, I mean, in other words, they just they shamelessly use that moral civil rights language just to basically try to win for themselves in a competition with another group of adults, and it's pretty shameful.
Yeah, so I have one more post that went pretty viral from a Georgia representative named Philip Singleton, and he posted this on Facebook, and I'm like, hey, this is. Doesn't sound too bad of a deal. He says, I propose a compromise. If the liberals want CRT so bad, critical race theory for listeners, I propose we allow CRT in public schools if they agree to 100% school choice. Every dollar of education funding goes directly to the parents, and they decide what school their children will attend. I think this is kind of the approach that we've taken on you and I, Bob. If we've said, if you want to teach this or that or the other in this, that, or the other school, fine. But if that doesn't work for whatever family, they shouldn't be forced to pay for it, and they shouldn't be forced to send their kid to that school.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I saw that. So where's this guy from? I saw this tweet you did.
Georgia.
Okay. All right.
I don't know which district, but he posted it on Facebook, and then I screenshotted it and put it on Twitter. And it has about 500,000 views.
Yeah. Well, what could be is some of these culture war things, including stuff like transgender athletes. I mean, that's another thing in the same story in the 74. They'll talk about freedom for transgender athletes without saying versus freedom for female, anatomically female students to compete against people with the same anatomy. In other words, they don't say these are two. This is oftentimes these issues are presented in a way as if there's no other side. Mm-hmm. And also too, on another level, I think some of these culture war issues may end up being the biggest drivers of school choice
Yep.
that we've ever seen.
Well, I mean, with the critical race theory stuff in the schools, that's been huge all over the news recently, with families going viral. And we've shared some of them on this podcast, pushing back against school boards. And, I think when it comes to the schools, in a lot of ways, families may feel fed up, with what's being taught in the schools. With over the past year, the schools weren't even opening, and they're pushing back. And this could further build momentum for school choice and having the money follow the child. I've taken the stance of, it might be, a lot of people even disagree on how they define critical race theory. That's why I'm also kind of skeptical in having the government come in and say you can or can't teach this or that, because then it's going to come into a shouting match about, well, this isn't that, this is something else, and then
Totally.
So since it's really hard to even agree on the definition, I think that's a stronger argument for allowing for more freedom and allowing people to vote with their feet.
There's not even the beginning semblance of a definition. Every time I hear anyone talk about it, it sounds different than the last person who talked about it. Right. So to some, it's as mild as respect others. Don't, we should be open-minded and nice to everyone. And then there's obviously the opposite version where it's, your skin color makes you guilty, or your skin color makes you a victim. And so, we got it.
So all right, man. That's all the stories I had.
All right. How you doing? Everything good?
Yeah, everything's great. I'm going to Denver tomorrow. If anybody's in the Denver area, I'll be there over the weekend for the Western Conservative Summit to talk about school choice stuff with Walter Blanks, also from AFC. Nice. So, that's what I'll be doing. How about you, Bob?
I don't have a big trip lined up, although I will be in North Dakota with you. South Dakota. With you next month. Yeah, for the Freedom Fest. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining Random Assignment. We'll see you next time.